So today we read articles and organizations. And she's got
Thank you so much for joining me today. So I thought I'll start actually with a little song to get things moving. And this is actually the Ebola song. So if you're from West Africa, we love music, and we actually make songs about everything, and also dances. So people made a song about Ebola. Very catchy.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm dancing in the studio to a song called Ebola in Town.
So this is Ebola in Town. There we go. The lyrics to wonderful.
I woke up in the morning, I started hearing people yelling.
So here you go. Just a little, sample to get started. It pretty much captures a lot of the climate in Liberia during the Ebola outbreak, and I'll come back to that. So I'm looking really at resilience and looking at it as a process of recovering from destructive conditions, drawing from the works of Bazanel for this definition. So we'll start with that basic definition to get started. If you look at my areas of scholarship, Dr. Dambo was talking about these. So here we go: trauma and resilience, culture, and then grassroots organizing. So I'm looking at these three. And I have ongoing questions about research, really trying to understand resilience as a communicative process. And we're looking at processes and practices, but also looking at different layers: symbolic, discursive, and material. And also, in terms of my own contribution, I'm trying to understand how resilience is also something that's culture-bound, right? Or situational. So, I'm arguing that it's not exactly the same everywhere, right? That people don't enact resilience the same way. So I'm using here in the study my situational communicated model that I've been working on, and I'll explain later. And then this broadly fits into a project which is about, decolonizing dominant Western-centered approaches to resilience and social change in organizational communication. So these are, questions to get started. In terms of traumatized communities, these are the ones that I've been working on. So I've done work on war and post-conflict. That was my first major project, right? And I also did some work on political homophobia in the Ivory Coast of Côte d'Ivoire and Liberia, looking at LGBTQ, people who identify as such and persecution in these two countries. And then more recently, post-Ebola recovery in Liberia. This is one of my pieces that I'll come back to because it ties in a lot of my ideas. This is really about trauma and organizing, but looking at memories as discursive and symbolic types of elements that reshape material features of organizations. So I was talking about the three layers. You have a good example for that here. I want to give you a little bit of context before I delve deeper into the study about Liberia. This is a 4 million people country. It's very small. actually. Most of the population, not most, a quarter of the population lives in the capital city of Monrovia, so we have a little bit more than 1 million people. And Liberia is so interesting in terms of resilience because it has experienced a lot of crises, and one of them, the most significant, is actually the war, civil war, 14 years, right? Which really destroyed a lot of the infrastructure, if not all. This is probably, for me, very shocking as an organizational scholar to go in a context like that and learn that we have a hard time in the West imagining that, but all organizational structures pretty much collapsed. How does that happen, right? So especially the more hierarchical ones, I mean, everything fell apart. So, because of the war, the population is generally very, there's a distrust towards the government and international community. And really, this history can help explain better also what happened during Ebola, especially at the beginnings of the epidemics, because, well, people thought that this was a conspiration, you know, so that was fairly widespread, right? So if you look at the outbreak, it spreads from March 2014 till September 2015, close to 5,000 deaths in Liberia only. And the most affected areas were the most densely populated, and obviously Monrovia was quite affected by that. I'll show you a couple of maps or charts. So here you go. This is the toll of death across the 3 countries, and this is, you know, Liberia. So close to 5,400, 4,800 or so, right? Guinea, and then Sierra Leone. So Liberia was the most affected, really, across the board. In terms of population density and number of cases. So here we go. This is Montserrado County. This is Monrovia is right here in Montserrado County. So you see that this is really a high spot in terms of number of cases. And then also that one was very significantly affected simply because it's really close to the Guinea border. So that's Lofa County. That's one of the counties really that was really deeply affected. So these are just a couple of maps for you to sort of get a little bit of context about, you know, the work that I'll do. So then I decided to go to Monrovia. So why? For several reasons, but really a lot of it had to do with the ways in which the media here in the US framed that whole situation. If you remember, you were reading the papers and all. It sounded really, apocalyptic, like the end of the world. Everybody was dying. Also, really no health infrastructure, nothing there, no capacity, no nurses, no doctors, and really very much focused on fear. And then recovery, according to that model, had to be something that would be, you know, externally driven, right? So we had to send, what, 3,000 US soldiers or so, right, the Obama administration. Which, by the way, is very interesting because when I did the interviews with community people, they told me we never saw these soldiers. Where were they? How were they helping the community, right? And they asked me, do you know where they were? I was like, no. I don't know where they went, right? And they told me that, so funny. So then, what about the grassroots and, you know, local networks and things like that? So there was not much, you know, discussion around that, really. So that made me curious and interested because I also studied that, and I know for a fact that Liberia, I mean, has a very rich history, like in terms of networks and things like that. If the more hierarchical types of organizations collapsed, actually a lot of those that were more trust-based and very informal were the ones that actually survived the war and put themselves really fast, I mean, back after the war. Right. Simply because really they had none of that hierarchical structure. They were really flat structures relying on trust. And these are the first organizations I studied for my major first project. So in terms of theory and theoretical framework, what am I using here? I'm building a communicative situational model to resilience. And I'm really drawing a lot on the work of Patrice Bazanal, actually, and Communication and Resilience Scholarship. She's so interesting because she argues that a lot of that resilience scholarship has been, you know, coming from psychology. So pretty much resilience is individually based, so positive psychology really. And she's more interested in looking at communication and, again, symbolic, discursive, and material types of dimensions, and how people, you know, collectively sort of recreate what it means to go back to normal, for instance, and then also a lot of other communicative processes, such as framing, for instance. So if you have something really bad that happens to you, really what's going to make the difference is how you frame that. So she says people tend to put in the background the more negative types of experience. Doesn't mean that you forget about them, it just means that you sort of put them in the background and then focus more on the positive, for instance. So I thought that was really interesting, and so I'm using that, and I'm trying to nuance her argument a little by adding, you know, situation. And in particular, this is coming from my own research, looking at three types of dimensions here. So temporal dimensions is the first one, and this is looking at time, right? If you look at resilience, can we say that necessarily all, maybe historical periods are really the same, right? All contexts are the same. I mean, if you look at environmental crisis, I don't know, in the US, and then maybe the context I'm looking at, is it the same, really? If you look at even war in Liberia, and then Ebola, the temporalities, I think, are different. So it calls for a more situated type of approach that takes that into consideration. Relational are really all about relationships, and I got really drawn to that when I was doing that first project, because what happened with war is that a lot of the kinship types of relations got somehow reverted in war, because of widely spread accounts of distrust between people and all of that, and sort of broke a little bit down the fabric of society and how people related to one another. So I'm sort of looking at that one too, and then structure, because obviously I study organizations, so I'm looking at structural and forms, really, different types of organizational forms in the process. And if, for instance, you look at resilience, some scholars have shown that, does it matter if prior to trauma you had like existing organizational structures, for instance? Can people draw on these for other purposes, things like that? So these are the three. So I'll talk more about my fieldwork now. So I did fieldwork in Old Matadi, which is a community in central Monrovia. And I'll show you pictures so you can visualize. So Old Matadi was so interesting for several reasons. So first, let me give you the basics. They formed an Ebola task force of 20 to 30 members. It was somehow flexible because, I mean, they allowed people to sort of join also at different times. So they pretty much went out how many people. They were like, yeah, 20, some say 30, right? So that was the range. Initiated by the community, so it was so interesting for that reason, and also funded by the community initially. What they did was really smart. They modeled the National Ministry of Health 4 pillars. So that was the Ministry of Health in Liberia that came up with that. They said, in order to fight this, we have to sort of have 4 divisions. We'll do contact tracing, which is, basically tracing all the people who come in contact with a sick person. Case investigation, in case we find somebody who's sick, just go back sometimes to the community they came from and investigate. Social mobilization was really more about raising awareness, and logistics, obviously, you'll see that here, supplies and things like that. So they pretty much raised awareness in their own community. They did a lot, distributed buckets, supplies, including chlorine, which is used to wash your hands. A lot of the wealthier people in the community donated to the task force so they could buy a lot of things. Even people who did not have much, that was so interesting, did what they could. So sometimes community members would cook for the task force if you don't have much money, or give a small collection of money. Those who really couldn't, they cleaned also the community on the weekends, things like that. It was also so peculiar because that community had no death from Ebola, which also made me even more interested, because several miles down the road, other neighboring communities, and I mean, Moravia is a closely knit city. You had that. So I thought that was really strange and unusual. I mean, 10, 20 miles down the roads, people die in here, but then nobody here. Why, right? They were so successful, actually, that they were used as a model for other task forces in other communities. And they even went to train these other task forces. So they were extremely successful. And it's really very interesting for many reasons. Very well organized. So this is coming from, these pictures are coming from they have a Facebook group, actually, called All Matadi Estate. And they launched the task force, etc. Oh, I should add that initially, when they started, like I said, they were self-funded. But a little bit later on, a couple of nonprofits donated. The health ministry helped by doing trainings and things like that. So along the way, they got help, a little bit more help. So that was, All Matadi Estate and its Environment Task Force on September 20th, 2014. Some of the task force members, here you go. It's funny because I know some of them and I interviewed them. Here you go. The buckets are very important. I'll come back to that. Distribution of buckets, and also, chlorine, I think, and then soap. Of course, West Africa, we don't do anything without dance, so you can't have a lunch party without having a dance party. So here you go, music, dance, and all. In terms of time. So what did I do? 14 that's I structured interviews, 45 minutes on average. I interviewed both task force members and also community members or dwellers, as they call them there. It's pretty much half-half. 45 minutes on average, but with the community members, the interviews tended to be a little bit shorter. And with task force members, they had a lot to tell me. And so these were way longer. In terms of research questions, really what I'm looking at is how these community members enact resilience during the Ebola crisis. Are there any types of specific communicative practices? Grounded theory analysis, pretty simple. And then while I'm doing the analysis, I'm also teasing out, my own dimensions. So to make sense of the data, which would be temporal, relational, and structural. So I'm combining these two. I have two preliminary findings to talk about today. They're just preliminary. I'm still working on a lot of this. It's very rich data. There's a lot. So, and interviews are still being transferred. So first, this is really, very interesting, and I'll elaborate why. The first really practice or process is really shutdown of the community, and that also ties into one of my previous studies. I'll explain that shutdown is really a closure, discursive and material. Where is the... this is starting here. So the first theme really, and this pertains more to structure. And so in order to understand, what goes on with the closure of the community, that's very important because what they told me, and I learned, is that during the war they had that vigilante or community watch coming directly from war times. These people, what they did is that they monitored access to the communities very strictly in terms of who goes out and, especially at night, because it was very dangerous. You had a lot of robbers and very, very risky. And especially that's a very important word, stranger. Because, no stranger allowed. Stranger encompasses, really a threat during war. Stranger, or sometimes they'll say strange person. So here we go. These are just a couple of quotes from somebody actually who was both in the vigilante group or watch team and then also in the task force. So he's a veteran and he's lived in Matadi for a long time, for what? Since, I think he told me since the 1990 also, right? Which is the onset of the first war. So it's very important. So what he's saying is, I'm not just a community dweller. I've immensely participated in the community-based services in this estate and back in the age. I kept a lot of the quotes as close as possible to Liberian English, so you also get a sense of how people talk. It's very important. After the 1990 in Persian, we used to have something called the Community Watch Team. I served as community block leader on one of those, you know, in this very community for the watch team control. This is one. Somebody else? Also very important, most people in that watch team were males, obviously, so there's also gender dynamic here. We all are put on the defensive for the community. Notice the word, right, defensive. That is a similarity, because I asked him, he was talking about that. So can you elaborate on the similarities and differences between the task force and that watch team? The slight difference is that the vigilante group was not looking after sick people. So that's what he's telling me. So that's really a first sub-team in terms of organization. And really what they're going to do is to enforce really strict and very ambiguous rules. I think that's important, especially in a context like Ebola. You can't really have ambiguity. So in terms of who comes in, who gets to go out, etc. So it's very strict. If actually I was, I think, not from that community and coming during the height of Ebola, I think I would have been a little bit concerned and scared of that task force, because really, from what they told me, they really did not joke around. It was very serious. They told me they went after people, because so what's important contextually to understand, a lot of people from the most affected areas in Moravia, when they noticed like several people dying, they fled. And they went to other communities where maybe they thought, okay, there are less people dying here. So they tried to sort of move to escape, you know, death. So they were on the watch for these people. And then, so this is one telling me, when you come into Matadi, the contact tracer will investigate the community you come from to know whether there isn't or there hasn't been any outbreak, whether you have affiliated with any Ebola patient. Before we allow you to come into our Matadi community, you will have to fill in a form. I mean, we have proceedings. It's very serious. Okay. Right, where is it? More about those rules. So once we allow you in our community, we are going to keep you under the banner of what is called surveillance. So notice again the words, right? We're not going to let you free in our midst until after 21 days, which is the number of days for quarantine. 21 or 42 to be more accurate, actually. Before we can give you the freedom to move around. Yeah. So they're really enforcing these rules. If you look at, again, that's another third sub-theme within that one. Really what these rules are doing is that they're somehow, again, reverting a little bit of the kinship norms. Because if you look at that cultural context, you do accept and you embrace people. And it's a culture of, you know, welcoming people in and all of that, right? But here, it's totally different, and I wanted to give you that example, and that was very good one, right? So that man telling me about his grandmother, and it was really sad. Could you imagine? It was so pathetic to the point that my grandmother came from the Gardnerville area. I said, Grandmom, when the task force sees you here, it will be a problem, so you have to go back. She felt bad, but she had to live with it, because I can't be the chief contact tracer stopping other people from coming in and then allowing her now to breach the rule. So he kicked out his own grandmother. But you don't do that again in that cultural context. Family and especially, elders are highly respected. And that is what made Matadi powerful, because she was not taking anybody, she, the community. In fact, we strangers, visitors never used to just come visit somebody at their house for a day. Meaning strangers or visitors never used to come inside the community. Next, this is the second one. So shutting down the community, but also creating an extreme sense of control. And I'll explain why it's so important and why it makes sense in terms of temporality over time in a second. But this is a classic Ebola suit that we saw in the media and on TV. Except that not everybody obviously could have one. They're expensive, they're not that practical, and obviously community members can't really walk around that. So then what I thought was really fascinating is this. It's creating their own, I call that technologies of resilience, by creating their own version of the suit. And I was like, wow. So what they're doing, And the suit is very simple. It's all to avoid sweat, which is how you get the virus. So wearing, so that's all they told me, wearing long sleeve shirts. So it's a very simple solution, very easy and very practical, especially when you travel in public transportation, because you sort of packed in a car. So they're telling me, wearing long sleeve shirts, we're wearing trousers, we're wearing like closed shoes, right? So you don't walk on vomit, which is how also you can get Ebola, or blood or something like that. And they really emphasize that. So at the time, within our estate, everybody here was indoors, you don't go out. And if you were going to the market or you were walking on the road, you had your long sleeves on. Very important. Because they told us to wear long sleeves. And they told us don't touch your friend. At that time, there was no friend or family business. That's a Liberian expression. They said no family business, nothing to do with your family, or no friend business. I had to protect myself, and I had to protect my household. Yes, and we always had our long sleeve on, and then we wash our hands. We always had chlorine for our house, for our toilets. This helps me transition into next technology, which is extreme sanitization. It's quite extreme. And it's normal in the context of Ebola, but how many times people had to wash their hands, right? So here we go. It extends to everything pretty much in your household, that idea of keeping yourself clean. At home here, we kept ourselves clean. If you came from outside, if you rode a taxi, you took a bath. When you came back, putting on clean clothes because you didn't know who you came in contact with. And then more. I have my Ebola bucket, I have my Dettol, and I always make sure my house is clean. If I cook my food, see more, it's not just about, again, your body, it's also about everything else in your environment. So if I cook my food, it boils well. So that's, again, more Liberian to say cooks really well. And I make sure my children are also clean. What else here? Not only that, but for extreme sense of control, you also need to signal safety in the community, so that's more collective, right? So how do you know that everybody else in the community is sort of doing what they're supposed to do? Well, I love that one here because that's a very important symbolic element if you look at communication. They call it the Ebola bucket. So it's a regular bucket, but it has, what do you call that? A little lid, so you put water, and you can sort of wash your hands, right? So this became pretty much the Ebola bucket during the epidemic, and everybody talks about it. They had like one bucket in front of their house, and then sometimes if you had a back door, also another one. So everybody who came inside had to pretty much wash your hands. There were a lot of funny stories about sometimes, I think, a dad tells me he comes back home and he forgot to wash his hands, and then his child, who's quite small, maybe 3 or 4, says, "Hey, you went inside without washing your hands, what are you doing?" Right? So even children were also part of that process. So here you go. We stayed in our houses. We never used to go out. We had our buckets right at the door. Everybody coming in had to wash their hands. More about, so these are a lot of Ebola buckets. So you get to see what they look like. And everybody, pretty much the task force made sure everybody had their Ebola buckets. Came back, do you need more? Is it broken or anything? Well, we'll get you some buckets. So why was I talking about temporality as being so important to make sense of that? It does because there's a total loss of control if you look at Ebola. And I asked actually quite a few questions about war and Ebola and the differences. And they told me actually they tended to prefer war, which if you look at it, war, especially in the Liberia context, was terrible. I mean, really, really, casualties, everything that happened, the rapes. But they said, yeah, it's still better than Ebola. We like it better. Because you can see your enemy, you can see if somebody's coming. Somehow under control. You can hide. You can get a stray bullet, but you can sort of hide. But Ebola is really framed for all of them as this invisible enemy. You never know where it's coming from or where. So then as a result, the only element that you control really is that environment, and that's why they spend so much time, sort of creating collectively that sense of safety and control in that community. So I have time for questions, so I'll sort of wrap up, probably tie that back into the previous study, and then we can talk about questions. So in terms of theoretical, conceptual, This is where maybe the culture-centered, my approach is coming in more compared to the literature, is the fact that we tend, I think, in a lot of the literature to frame resilience as something that's quite positive, focus on integrative or integration. Positive communication, so even if you look at some of Bazanel's work, she's saying, yeah, you sort of put the negative in the background and focus on really the positive. But here I'm really saying, not so much. Maybe it's better to talk about that in terms of situation. So I'm arguing for a more situational approach and maybe more destructive, and some of these processes are not that nice. I mean, shutting down the whole community, that extreme sense of control, surveillance, but I think in the present type of context, that Ebola just makes sense. So that's pretty much the crux of my approach and my argument here. And I'm still, keep in mind, I'm still, unpacking the findings and working on that. So next step really, and that's what I'm trying to do, is to figure out the relationship between these two themes that I've talked about, shutting down the community and then the extreme sense of control. How do they relate to one another really? I'm still thinking through that and trying to figure out the connection. Any questions? Yeah?
Are the people in that community more educated or anything than?
Compared to some of the groups that I've worked with, a little bit more. And the task force, there's some nuances too between the community dwellers and the task force members. Task force members, and they really stressed that, they said, well, we will have, high school educations or degrees. Quite a few of them were teachers for local, schools and things like that. And they talked a lot about education. They said certain people don't enforce the measures because they're not educated. In terms of the community people, that really varied. I had people who weren't that educated really, or not much. And I think that's where the difference is.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean exactly by situational approach? I'm thinking about, for example, when there's another outbreak, I could see just experience being part of that situation. I could see a situation where people who had experienced a great tragedy like this, an epidemic, the next time something comes along, either being more resilient because they've been through it, or actually panic more, and being more concerned because they saw how bad the last one was.
Yeah, and I think I'm building on that in my argument, probably because I'm not talking too much in depth about my model, but builds on that. I'm really trying, that's why I went back also to establish, in terms of even structure and things like that, connections between war times and then Ebola, and saying that they retain those communities a lot of structures pertaining to war that were sort of tapped into during Ebola. And so, he makes the Liberian context, generally speaking, very specific in terms of situation, if you look at that structure. But then also within that situation, you have variations because, war and Ebola, although you have the same type of structure, are not exactly the same. So it's bringing really a nuance to an argument that tends to frame things either as positive or negative. Again, centered on Western-centered, I think, approaches and even, feminism's oppositions between agency and structure, or discourse and agency and things like that. Yeah.
Didn't you do stuff about memory too?
Yeah, I did.
Because this reminds me, it's like the memories of the war might frame how they might respond or enact or do resilience. But then also the negative reaction, like you would rather have war.
Yeah.
That seems to play a key part in this.
Yeah. So the previous study really was on memories and that closure. Maybe that's what I needed to add. That shutting down of community. In my previous study, I talked about that with more informal grassroots, and I call that contraction, which is also a resilience type of practice, where their alternative organizations really sort of contracted and solidified around certain elements like gender, class, and nation. If they were more flexible before war, after war, they were like, no. In terms of nationality, we're not allowing anybody who is not Liberian, right? In terms of gender, we have been flexible before war, but we're sort of only allowing women now. and et cetera, et cetera. So,
I think the Civil War piece of that is really interesting, and I think perhaps because that broke down all the hierarchical structures, and there was a general mistrust, that mistrust of people is a positive resilience characteristic here, because you don't trust even your grandma. I can't even let you come in.
Exactly.
And it's fascinating to me how quickly they developed a structure, the buckets, and all
very
of that,
fast.
in an environment where they had no hierarchical
Exactly.
dependability
Right.
to do those things. That they somehow managed to get highly organized very quickly,
Right.
probably because they mistrust everyone and they wanted to have a procedure they could make their grandma or their kid do, right? It's fast. It's an interesting case study.
And this ties in also back to previous research where that relational dimension that I was talking about also deals with trust between people. And I said that I'm talking about amplification and amplification of more negative features when you think about trust, right? Which sort of redefine, relationships differently, I guess.
Yeah.
So they tended after war to sort of use distrust as their criterion to judge somebody.
It seems very positive for how they were able to adapt and respond so quickly here. So something that you would see in one context is maybe negative. It's really positive for their resilience.
Yeah.
I wanted to hitchhike on Jeff's question because your situational approach and a broader application here would be interesting to compare other West African communities that didn't have a war background.
Exactly.
Although the civil wars did affect a lot of the nations or the areas, but find some that had a real incidence of Ebola and hadn't gone through a civil war.
I'm thinking of Guinea because that's the one I wanted to look at because Guinea did not have that experience of Liberia. Sierra Leone also had civil war, right? They both were affected by Ebola, right? Okay. So it would be quite interesting.
So with the dismantling of trust and hierarchy, did you see within the task force some kind of micro-hierarchy, or do you think that people within the task force form trust among themselves in response to mistrust of others?
There's definitely, some type of hierarchy, obviously, and so first, maybe not like that, but along the four. So it was pretty much quite decentralized in terms of organization, but we do have 4 pillars. We have contact tracing, we have logistics, and we sort of relate, it was very egalitarian, we sort of relate, not the boss necessarily, but sort of equally amongst peers. But I think because you also have very practical concerns, each of these 4 divisions had a leader, right? Because you do need, in a situation of crisis, you can just be like, oh yeah, just decentralize, and you still need some type of leadership that tells you, okay, that's what we need to do. We need like 50 buckets in that place, and now you do this, that, and that.
And do you think that between the leaders of the 4 pillars, did you find that they were more trusting of each other, or did you find that there was even mistrust within?
No, they trusted each other. Okay. Yeah. The distrust, I think, in that situation was a lot geared towards outsiders and strangers. Strangers, that was the big term. Anybody who's not from that community was a stranger.
This is beyond the scope of what we've talked about, but how does this information communicated within this community?
How was it communicated?
Yeah, so how did people
about Ebola?
The information?
So the task force was pretty much on the ground every day. Every day they went so they divided the community into different blocks, A, B, C, D, I think, E, F, G. And then different people from task force were assigned a block. So every day or so they were making rounds, going from house to house. Is anybody sick in this house today? Okay. They had also established how many people lived in each house, right? Meaning that it made it easier if somebody came and was like, hey, that person was not here yesterday or 3 days ago. What's happening? Why do you have 5 people when you usually have 2, right? And pretty much diffusing that information. Also very visual, wearing T-shirts. So Do I answer?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot actually this, more practical implications. That was the last slide. Looking at health and health practitioners, I think it's very important to tap into these grassroots networks very early. I think if we had done that a little bit earlier, we would have probably made a difference. They told me all that people didn't really come to them. That's why they had to organize, and on their own. And then later on, the NGOs and all, kicked in when they realized they had no control of the situation whatsoever. And they said, oh, maybe these people know what they're doing. So it shows you, the importance of organizing. It's very important. And informal organizing, networks of trust within the community.
Do they go back? I don't know if you said this when you talked about the temporality of resilience, but I think it's so fascinating how I think what I hear you saying is they kind of throw out some of the kinship rules in the face of a crisis.
Yes.
And then
they go back. They go back to normal when it's back to normal.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they told me pretty much, yes, your friend couldn't visit, your cousin, your parents, nobody, But then I think they'll probably
That's what
go
I mean
back.
about the mistrust of everyone. It even extended to what would be normal kinship types. It's fascinating.
So in other words, they had to set aside some cultural norms.
Yes.
In order to get through
the crisis.
But it's not even set them aside, it's actually the opposite. It's not even, it's like
Right.
the other extreme, right, of enacting
Okay, I
very
see what you
rigid
mean.
boundaries.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the previous study, I talk about polarization. And I say that type of trauma has the ability to polarize. So it's like these discursive elements are polarizing building blocks that reconstruct organization, but almost like the opposite of what they were, because they're so extreme that they push you in the opposite polarity. So then all traumatized communities are not the same, obviously, because of that, right? All trauma is not the same, and I can't really say that. So you have to be, again, situational. That's my whole point. Yeah.
I would be curious to see if there were some type of long-term relational impact, because that grandmother, oh, sorry, you can't come in. Oh, we're fine now.
He told me I didn't
study.
I didn't put the end of the quotes, but he was telling me the rest of the story, and he was like, she understood, and she went back and she actually told people from her community that, so that they knew that you shouldn't do that and go and visit your parents or relatives or grandsons who would kick you out. In that case, yeah.
Just really quick, what was, maybe this wasn't played at all, but what was the impact of technology, thinking about it?
It was very important, and like I mentioned, those pictures were retrieved from their Facebook page, right? That's why I saw the question that Dr. Myers was asking me is important. She said, were they educated, the people you actually interviewed? The task force people were quite educated, quite technologically savvy, right? So what they did is they created a Facebook page.
And
they
also, or television also?
Television?
TV.
Do they have television?
Oh, yes, they do. They have TV, yeah. And they have radios are very important. So they told me even these messages were reinforced over and over on the radio about how to keep yourself clean. Okay, wash your hands constantly, right? Do this, don't eat, mangoes or plums because bats eat those. And it was funny, a lot of the rules, they sort of almost memorized them by heart because I told them, so what are you supposed to do? I said, okay, don't eat plums, don't eat bats, don't play with dead bodies, which is Liberian expression. Doesn't mean that you're actually playing, but it just means touching, so don't play with dead bodies. So first when I heard it, imagine I was giggling in my head. It's so strange, but yeah.
You talked about one example was you were interviewing that they were asking, where are the Americans? Where are all the...
Yeah.
Did you experience any tension with sort of insider-outsider experiences as you were going through that?
I told my students that this semester that I'm a white woman in Liberia. Can you imagine that? It's probably one of the few contexts where I'm white. Even in the Ivory Coast, where my mom is from, I'm not white, but there, it was everywhere. And I was riding bikes, so you had like children taunting you, but making fun like a white woman in a bag, that type of stuff.
So you felt like an outsider.
I did.
Yeah.
I tried as much as possible to sort of emphasize the fact that I was from West Africa.
Yeah.
That I had been to Liberia multiple times. I speak Liberian English, so that also sort of, I guess that really helped bridge that gap.
Sure.
Because a lot of these interviews, not all of them were in standard English. With the less educated, I guess, community members, it was Liberian English, which is a vernacular. So I did them. And once they heard me and heard my accent, and then they were, okay, more comfortable. Yeah.
Sort of on that point, did you, logistically, as you're setting up these interviews, did you have any resistance to consent to do interviews, to participate in the study, or was everybody open to interviews?
Well, so what happened is that you have to be strategic. So I think I started interviewing some of the people in the task force that were really well regarded, I guess, and they sort of vouched for me. And they pretty much, it was two men, they pretty much set a lot of people for me. They're like, okay. And there's also a gender dynamic to that, right? Because a lot of the men in the field want to show off to women, and here's researchers coming from the US, let me show you my expertise. So they love to talk to me. They're like, oh yeah. So then they were like, yeah, they took it upon their mission. Yeah, we're gonna, so when you're coming, we're gonna set up these interviews, okay? Okay, we got you like that person and this one, yeah. So it worked pretty well once I started doing that. But initially it took a long time because I had a lot of leads at the beginning and a lot of obstacles related to local politics and things like that. So I couldn't start immediately. I only started maybe 3 weeks after I arrived. So at the beginning I lost some time.
Yeah, on a global level it's controversial for when we get involved and when we help. So how would that community have responded had the task force been like Americans and tried to come in and help, or like did that community build other areas of that community since they internally fixed their own problem?
Oh, I see what you mean. In terms of outside intervention, like...
Yeah, how America will sometimes send the Red Cross or send people to go help, and they didn't have that external help. So how would they have responded had like a task force been outsiders?
I think initially they would have been open. Like the only sort of resentment was just that people didn't consult them and didn't come to them. Hence the comment also about the US soldiers. I mean, where are they? We heard that they are on the ground, but we haven't seen a single one, right? And about some of the NGOs, they didn't come to talk to us and ask us what we're doing, or we know everybody in this community, right? And so, yeah, so I think, yeah, I see what you mean. I think they would have been open initially, just resented maybe the way it was done. Like just ignoring them and consulting them last, or, oh, okay, we're doing everything wrong. Oh, maybe we could go to the community. And
Thank you.
Thank you.